So what you've got is this strange 50-year-old story of 24 astronauts flying through these Van Allen radiation belts with no apparent harm to them at all. In the 50-year intervening period, no other human has gone anywhere near these Van Allen radiation belts. NASA say it's a problem they have yet to solve. The Russians know it's a problem and haven't solved it. The Chinese, we don't know what's happening, but presumably they're working on it.
That was brought up earlier that there's been pictures that were just released of Chinese craft took pictures of the moon's surface. Nobody put the pictures in there, but that's what they're saying. You don't believe that either, right?
The Chinese craft was an unmanned craft.
Okay.
And it's perfectly possible to land unmanned craft on the lunar surface. That I don't challenge that.
Gotcha.
The Russians did it. In fact, they were the first to land a soft landing on the moon in 1959. The Chinese have done it. The Americans have done it with the Surveyor craft, the Orbiter craft. These were all unmanned. This is the difference. Humans are very delicate little creatures. We need a lot of protection. It's been worked on around the world. People are working on solving this problem. And I imagine that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson are probably addressing the problem now. I saw the recent assembly of Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin craft. Very impressive. Elon Musk has done some remarkable work with his lunar lander. But is he going to put humans in it? Well, he says he is. But how's he going to ensure their protection? Because it would be let's just say it would be rather bad publicity if he put humans in it, sent them to the moon, and they came back dead. Because that's what happens if you get exposed to extreme levels of radiation. There are many stories being put out by NASA right now, quite recently.
And it's like, how did Apollo astronauts get through the Van Allen belts? And what they're saying is that it's speed and trajectory. You're saying these things are propaganda. So they're saying that it's a common misapprehension that all radiation is some sort of magic death ray. They said it's not. What they're saying is type, dose, and duration of radiation make all the difference, and that we evolved on a radioactive planet, and sunlight is the type of radiation, so is nuclear radiation, and that kills, but it also can be stopped by our outer layer of our dead skin cells. But even our bones are weakly radioactive, and we've evolved to handle the gamma rays that they produce within our bodies just fine. And long before Apollo, NASA launched a fleet of probes to map and characterize the Van Allen belts, and they have a diagram here. The belts primarily consist of an inner band of energetic protons and an outer band of electrons, all trapped from the solar wind by the Earth's magnetic field. So for manned space travel, the primary concern is the inner belt, and the Apollo missions were planned as to pass through the inner belt on the night side of the Earth, when the radiation intensity is lower and at a relatively high inclination, so as to pass through the thinnest ear of the inner belt. And probe data indicated, and actual dosimeters worn by the Apollo crews confirmed, that the total exposure due to the Van Allen belt passage would be about the equivalent of a chest x-ray. In other words, they're saying it's nothing to worry about. And this is what you're saying has been handed out as propaganda. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, basically it's that. It's NASA is rewriting their story. It's basically in response to the considerably increased number of challenges to NASA. Well, how did you get through these Van Allen radiation belts? And this is their answer. We launched at night, so it was less, and we went up through the poles, and we skirted around the edge of the belt, so we didn't really affect it very much. It was like a couple of chest x-rays. If you look at the original press packs, these are publicly available, the Apollo press packs, which outlined in considerable detail everything that would happen on each mission. And I've read these press packs. I've looked at the information which is contained in them. These were written at the time of the launches, i.e. in the 1960s, 69 for Apollo 11, 72 for Apollo 17. These were written when they happened. That's what press pack was about, so that the press could get the information before the launch and they could report it. That was what it was all about. In those press packs, there are about 200 or 300 pages long, are diagrams showing how they were going to launch what they call TLI, translunar injection, i.e. they would launch towards the moon. They did it over the Pacific, which is nowhere near the North Pole, according to my geography. They didn't skirt around the belt, they went straight through them. NASA are now rewriting their records, which is basically a bit dishonest, rather than addressing the problem when other parts of NASA are saying we do have a major problem with radiation. It's a matter of who you believe. Do you believe what NASA said at the beginning of the Apollo missions, that we're going to go straight through the belts? Or do you believe what they're writing about now? We went through the pole. Well, technically that's not possible. You can't just change direction from the middle of an orbit. And anyway, if you did, you wouldn't get to the moon. If you launch out through the Earth's polar region, you're heading well away from the moon. If you launch over the Pacific, you just accelerate so that you can overcome Earth's gravity. You have to accelerate from 18,000 miles an hour, which is Earth orbit speed, to 25,000 miles an hour, which is leaving Earth's gravity. If you do that, you've got to basically fire off in the direction you want to go, because otherwise you're going to have to change direction. They seem to have missed out that bit. So this radiation question is still a major issue. Yes, humans are able to withstand levels of radiation. That's why we have melanin in our skins, which protect us from the ultraviolet rays. It's the ultraviolet which causes tanning. It's always interesting, I find, that the white race will tan, and the black race, which normally lives in more tropical climates, appear to be well tanned already. It's as if somebody got it wrong, because white-skinned people are susceptible to tanning, which is a form of radiation. You're quite right. Yes, our skin will deflect certain of the electromagnetic spectrum, but if we get too much of it, it'll cause us a major problem. It's called cancer. What we need to avoid is that. Now, I mentioned the Orion craft, launched in December 2014. One of the things it carried in it were radiation meters to measure levels of radiation. You think they'd know what the levels were by now. They'd sent 9 Apollo craft through these alleged radiation belts, or allegedly sent them through the belts. You'd think they'd know what the levels were. But on the Orion craft, they carried fairly sensitive radiation meters. And surprise, surprise, it was much higher than they thought. And the Orion craft only went 3,600 miles out from the Earth's surface and then came back again. It didn't even go through the outer belt.
So what we need to look at is the launch trajectory, the geography of the launches that don't make sense with the orbits that would be in order to get to the moon properly. We're not looking at that enough, is what you're saying. Here's another question that's come in on the text line as far as the moon's atmosphere. And he said, if Marcus is saying we never went to the moon, how can we prove the moon has no atmosphere? What are your thoughts?
Do NASA tell the truth about everything all the time? I rather doubt it, to be honest. Don't forget that NASA are part of the Department of Defense, which is charged with defense of the American people, the American homeland. That's fair enough. That's what it's there to do. NASA are part of that. Now, we've all seen pictures of the space shuttle. It no longer flies, regrettably, but it was quite an impressive piece of kit when it flew. Why is it the shape it was? It was a sort of stumpy glider. It had a cargo container, a cargo section in the middle, which was 60 foot long by 20 foot in diameter. Why was it that size? So it could launch spy satellites. That was its purpose. That was what it's designed for. It wasn't just to fly seven astronauts up to the space station, which hadn't been built when the shuttle started flying. It started flying in 1981. It was launched, it was up in space, and basically NASA didn't know if the tiles which would protect it, and obviously we know what happened with Columbia, when its heat shield tiles were damaged, and it came back and it basically disintegrated. It was considered that some of the heat shield tiles may possibly have been dislodged. So how could they find out if they were dislodged and ensure that the astronauts would be safe enough to come back? What they did was something quite extraordinary. Obviously, there were spy satellites orbiting at that time, the hexagon being one of them. And what they did, they achieved an interception of the space shuttle by the spy satellite, so it could photograph the Columbia space shuttle as it flew past, and that would determine if any of the heat shield tiles had been dislodged. It was an incredible achievement to do it, but it was done. The photographs taken by the hexagon at that time, it was one of the later hexagons which had digital equipment on board, that was transmitted back down to Earth, and they could get the photographs and examine them, which they did, and discovered that the heat shield tiles were still intact, so there wasn't a major problem, and Columbia came back quite safely. And it also demonstrated the ability to maneuver and time two orbiting spacecraft on different orbits. Hexagon was on a polar orbit, and the space shuttle was on basically an equatorial orbit, though it was maneuvered into a position where it could meet the hexagon to be photographed. This wasn't known about until probably a couple of years ago, that this had actually happened. So the technology to achieve orbit and maneuver in orbit was at that time fairly well known, but we're talking 1980s here. We're not talking 1960s, 1970s. There are differences.
That makes sense. So what I'm convinced about is the most that's convinced me so far is the TV signal. I mean, I've always thought about that too. You know, the cameras, and I believe there's quite a long explanation of that in the chat room that I really don't want to read right now. But you know, showing everybody on television and thinking about the possibilities of that, I actually have studied that.
Now, many people will say, "Oh, well, you've seen all those people on the moon jumping around, or it looks like they're in slow motion. You just film it a bit faster and transmit it at a slow motion speed, and it appears that they're on the moon." It's not as simple as that, because what this film, Make Believe Smoke and Mirrors, did, and it's now been subtitled, and there are various websites where you can see it. It's not on YouTube anymore. It's one of those things that have been censored, as have some of my talks.
But in all fairness, I would say that if you believe, Marcus, and this is just playing devil's advocate here, but if you believe that the launch was real, but the rockets were lost in some other orbit, what could they have actually done at that point to prove to us that they were there, other than television, other than radio? I mean, in my mind, there's nothing that they could have done that would have factually proved it.
No, that's that's one of the major problems. It's a question I get asked fairly frequently. Well, what will convince you that they did land on the moon? I say it's very simple. What will convince me is maybe the result of something like the X Prize, where Google putting up $30 million for somebody who could launch an unmanned craft to land on the moon, move 500 meters, and take high-definition photographs. And obviously NASA got wind of this and said, no, we've got an exclusion zone around Apollo 11. You can't come nearer than 2 kilometers. Well, put that kibosh on that one. If somebody could produce high-definition, indisputable evidence in photographs or film of something that man has put on the moon, I would believe it. And I'll shut up, apologize, and go away. But no, that hasn't happened yet. Somebody at this point is now saying, oh, they've done it already. They did it in 2009 with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. They took photographs of all the landing sites of the Apollo craft. Yeah, I've seen those photographs too. I know what Photoshop can do. And that's what happened. They were Photoshopped images. But they're actually ridiculously stupid images, because the only way we know what we're looking at is because NASA, God bless them, have put whacking great arrows on the photograph saying Apollo 11 lander, or ALSEP, Apollo Lunar Surface Experimental Package. Or look, we got the wheel tracks of the rover. We've got the footprints of the astronauts. Oh, wow. Of course that's real, we'll say. No, it's not. It's Photoshopped. And you can tell it's Photoshopped because the footprints of the astronauts are as wide as the lander. What are they, giants or something? 20 foot wide? Ridiculous. Now, I expect most people will have looked on Google Maps and Googled their own house and looked at the car parked outside and said, oh, look, it's got a sunroof. I know which way it's pointing. Yeah, that's what Google Maps can show. And somebody at this point will say, oh, no, they're not taken from space, they're taken from aircraft just flying above it. No. If you look specifically for satellite photographs of Earth, you can see that amount of detail. It's called the GeoEye-1 satellite. And I have a photograph taken by the GeoEye-1 satellite, 640 kilometers above the Earth's surface, or 400 miles, which shows, in this case, the London Eye, which has little cabs on it, which you travel in and look at all the wonderful sights of London. And just off a little further away from the London Eye is a car park where all the people in the London Eye have parked their cars so they can go on it. And you can see the cars in the car park, and you can see the sunroof on the roof, and you can tell which way it's pointing. Cars are about a little bit smaller than the lunar landers. The average car is about 15 foot long. The lunar lander is about 15 foot wide if you include part of the legs. On the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter photograph showing these alleged landing sites, you see nothing of that detail. You see a few white pixels surrounded by a few black pixels, which is supposed to be the shadow. It's not even an extended shadow. It could be a rock, could be a bright image. It certainly doesn't convince me it's an Apollo landing craft. Get this, these were taken by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter from 15 miles above the lunar surface, shooting through the vacuum of space, compared to the atmosphere and pollution in the Earth's atmosphere from 400 miles above the Earth. I don't buy it. I don't buy that these photographs show anything at all that man has had anything to do with, other than the photoshopping of the image. It's a ridiculous story. It's yet another diversionary tactic by people desperate to cling on to the sad story of the Apollo moon landings, the greatest achievement of the 20th century. And here am I, sitting over here as dawn is breaking in the UK, challenging one of the great achievements of American technology. Well, I'm sorry if it upsets people, but do you want the truth or do you want the Disney-fied version? I want the truth. If you're happy with Disney, fine, that's okay. Not a problem. But you've got to live with it.